Yeah, just my take on things. My answer to number two. Guided discovery. Identifying, challenging your beliefs. Reframing your mind, negative thoughts release. Those cognitive distortions decrease until they cease. Let's go. Guided discovery. Identifying, challenging your beliefs. Reframing your mind, negative thoughts release. Yeah, just my take on things. My answer to number two. Guided discovery. Identifying, challenging your...
Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Peplau's Ghost. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited about our guest today, Andrew Penn from the University of California, San Francisco. Really excited to kind of learn a little bit about his practice and his exciting work using psychedelics integrated with psychotherapy. So really excited. Joined again by my faithful colleagues, Kate Molino from UCSF, Kendra Delaney from Vanderbilt, and Melissa Chapman from Minnesota, the non-nurse who keeps us in line. So thank you so much for everybody for joining us here. I'm going to do kind of a quick introduction. Andrew kind of mentioned we want to keep this short, but that is not easy to do. He is a very well-accomplished individual that definitely needs to be celebrated. So basically, Andrew is been in mental health care for over 30 years. He is a faculty trained at the University of California, San Francisco, also teaches psychopharm there, involved with phase 2 of a psilocybin-facilitated therapy for major depression, which was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. So that's a big deal. Nice. Very good. He's also adjunct and teaches at San Francisco Veterans Administration, co-founder of the Open Nurses, a professional organization for nurses interested in psychedelic research, has also co-chaired and is on the steering committee for the NP Institute, also involved with a variety of other things, has spoken kind of everywhere. I'm looking at your bio, South by Southwest, you spoke that. You've had a TED Talk, and we're just sharing you had an interview with BBC. So again, thank you for coming to our humble little podcast here, and really look forward to kind of getting to know more from you with these questions. So excuse me. Thank you, Andrew. So first question I have for you, when did you first get interested in psychedelic psychotherapy?
I think my interest in psychedelics actually goes back to high school. I read Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception when I was, 15 or 16. I think I'd heard somewhere that the rock band The Doors had gotten their name from that book. And, this is in the 80s. So psychedelics were definitely in this sort of deep freeze, following this sort of things that happened, both good and bad in the 1960s. And so it seemed like another world far away, but it was an intriguing book. I mean, for those who are unfamiliar, this was Aldous Huxley's first experience with mescaline, which was actually given to him by a sort of adopted Canadian. Kate, I'm looking at you here. Humphrey Osmond, who was really leading a lot of the research in the 1960s in Canada using LSD with patients that we would now call having alcohol use disorder. And so psychedelics have long been sort of in the culture. And so I think the idea of using them therapeutically, which was an idea I think I started reading about maybe in the early 2000s, really intrigued me. And also it sort of parallels my own experience with conventional psychiatric treatment, which was that when I was trained, I graduated UCSF in 2005. We were going to save the world with psychopharmacology. Just a little pinch of that was going to make everything all better. And I believed that for a while, and I practiced that way. And I was, and over a while, I began to feel a little bit disillusioned with this idea that there was going to be a pill for every ill, and that these medications, I don't want to disparage medications. I think that there's a lot of useful things we can do with them, but the notion of what if we could actually move psychiatry from ostensibly a palliative practice. Again, no shade on palliative care. It's an important practice. But what if we could actually start getting people better to the point where they didn't need treatment? Maybe, I mean, cure is a really hubristic word, but what if we could get people well enough that psychiatric treatment became more episodic rather than chronic? So that was another idea that really started to intrigue me, and I've also long had an interest. Yeah, also back in around that same early impressionable time, I read Viktor Frankl and learned about the idea of making meaning from suffering. And one of the things that maybe we can talk more about in our conversation is some of the experiences that people have under psychedelic therapy and the process of possibly finding meaning in things that have often been challenging for them in their lives. And that is something that can come out of these treatments, not always, but can. So all these things kind of converged to really get my attention some time ago. And then I got lucky enough to start doing some of this research work, working with a lab here at UCSF on a number of different studies that have involved psilocybin primarily, but I also worked on the MDMA PTSD study about 6 years ago now. So it's been an interesting journey.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I think we were just talking about this in another conversation, just how things we do is kind of long time ago kind of keep bubbling up to the surface. If it's, something that's meaningful and impactful, I think we just never let it go. We just we hold on to it, and it just keeps twirling in the back of our brain somehow. So yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that story.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to add, Andrew, I appreciate how you are both a, proponent of psychedelic therapy in the present and future, and also kind of a historian. And I also want to note for our listeners out there that Andrew also did a really great interview with Kay Parley, who's a registered nurse in Saskatchewan, which was a follow-up to an interview that was done with her in the 60s that was published in the American Journal of Nursing, if I recall correctly. So
1964, she wrote an article called Supporting the Patient on LSD Day, which
love that.
I was amazed to find. And yeah, we went and interviewed her last winter. She's now 101 years old, sprightly, and currently working on trying to transcribe and edit that interview down to it was 5 hours. We had 5 hours of recording. She had a lot of energy for a 101-year-old, and get that out into the world in a way that people can appreciate her, because she was really a visionary and a pioneer.
Well, I'd love to pop in and, psychedelic therapy or assisted therapy is something that I feel like is such a hot topic right now. And, I've had, patients come to me and say, well, I'd like to do this, but like, what does that actually look like? Could you give our listeners, a sense of what do people actually mean when they mean psychedelic therapy? And are there any modalities that you integrate with psychedelic therapy that really stand out to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is definitely, it's been in the media a lot, and I think patients are starting to come to us and ask us questions about it. So it's important for even if nurses aren't delivering this treatment to their patients to at least know about it so they can point them in the right direction. It's also important to understand that really the only compound that is legal and readily available that is psychedelic-like would be ketamine, or it's an enantiomer S-ketamine. In some municipalities, in some states like Colorado, there are programs where things like psilocybin can be used clinically. It's sort of an interesting third way, because obviously it's still illegal in the U.S. under the Controlled Substance Act federally, but kind of like cannabis, which is also a Schedule 1 drug, there are beginning to be these sort of workarounds. And so when patients come to us asking about psychedelic therapy, they may not be aware that these things are not readily available outside of research settings. I think it's important for all nurses to know about clinicaltrials.gov, an amazingly easy to use government website, which those two words don't usually always go together, but it's about as easy to use as Google. And from that, you can type in, say, depression and psilocybin, and it will direct you to studies that are recruiting or may soon be recruiting, and you can limit by geography and such. So that's a useful reference to know. And then the most readily available sort of psychedelic-like treatment. And by that, I mean, I should probably clarify what we're talking about, because I think sometimes people imagine that, what are we talking about? Taking LSD every day? Like, that sounds not tenable, and it wouldn't be. So the idea of using a psychedelic in a therapeutic context is different than, say, taking fluoxetine or something like that, where you're taking a pill every day. The idea is that it's really a psychotherapy model that is enhanced with the limited use of a psychedelic in a supervised setting. And so what I mean by that is that in our studies, what we do is we have preparatory non-drug psychotherapy. So I will meet with a subject who's going to be in one of our trials multiple times to talk to them, to get to know them, get to know what they want to work on, what concerns they have, for them to get to know me. So very much that nursing model where there's a sort of a bi-directional working together that's happening. And then on the day of dosing, so we might do that 2 or 3 times, depending on the study protocol. So, it could be up to 6 hours or so of preparatory non-drug psychotherapy. Then the day they come in for the dosing, I'm going to meet with them again. I'm going to have a dosing assistant with me. So there'll be 2 people there the whole time. And we're going to get them settled in. We're going to make sure their blood pressure is okay. We're going to make sure they're comfortable. We're going to revisit whatever intentions they set in the preparatory therapy. And then they're going to ingest usually psilocybin. It's or if it's a randomized controlled trial, it could be a placebo. And we're going to settle in there for the whole day. It's kind of a living room-like environment. It's quiet. It's comfortable. We have soft music going in the background. We have eye shades available if people want to kind of direct their attention inward. Sometimes there's talking going on. A lot of times there isn't, and we can get more into that if we want to. The drug reliably has a pretty predictable pharmacokinetic course. So, typically with psilocybin, people are feeling something within about 30 to 45 minutes. The peak effects are about 2 to 3 hours. And then there's sort of a several hour tail where it wears off. And usually by hour 5 or 6, they're back to their sort of normal state of mind. Their ride picks them up. The next day we get on a Zoom call usually, and we begin to integrate that experience. So we talk about what happened for you during that dosing day, what feelings came up, what memories came up, what emotions, what thoughts came up. And we try and look for opportunities to make sense out of that, and also to integrate any kind of learnings or experiences into their day-to-day life. So somebody may have had, for example, somebody with depression might have had the realization like, oh my gosh, I really contribute to my own aloneness. I feel really lonely, and I also contribute to it because I withdraw from people who are reaching out to me. And so, like we might do with regular therapy, we might say, well, how could that be different? We might set a very small goal of like, okay, so what if you reach out to 2 people between now and next time we talk? To really start to take that very kind of abstract idea of like, wow, I had this realization that I was like this one person on this little tiny island all by myself, but there's a bridge that I never went across. Well, okay, so what would going across that bridge look like? Well, maybe it would involve like reaching out to people that have been trying to reach out to me that I'm not responding to their texts. Okay, is that something you'd be willing to do? And between now and next week? Yeah. So, you kind of take this very abstract idea and try and bring it into something that is maybe actionable and less abstract.
Yeah, Andrew, thanks so much for going through that. I think it's so valuable because I agree. I think there is a lot of, I don't know if it's confusion, but just maybe mystery around what does, this type of psychotherapy entail.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you would share maybe a success story from a session, or, any sessions you had that kind of taught you something.
Yeah, I think about my very first one that I did, which was this was it was in the MDMA PTSD trauma trial that we were doing, and this is without getting into too much identifying detail, somebody who had experienced trauma many years before, and was in many ways a very affable, likable person. Tended to be very chatty, which I can relate to, but would also sometimes use talking as a way of kind of distracting himself from his emotional experience. It was a well adapted kind of trait. And so this particular protocol, we actually had 3 dosings. So we kind of went through that, wash, rinse, repeat cycle 3 times on this study. And there was therapy in between each of the dosing, several doses, several opportunities for therapy without drug. And what we noticed, me and my co-therapist, was that the subject tended to talk a lot in the first session. And that sometimes happens with MDMA. MDMA is qualitatively different than psilocybin in that MDMA tends to be a little more social, whereas psilocybin tends to be a little more it tends to be a little more introspective, just sort of in very broad terms. You can certainly have introspection on MDMA. But nevertheless, he sort of spent a lot of the first session really talking a lot. And it felt like he was almost felt like he needed to entertain us. And I always make that clear with subjects that we're going to be sitting here with you, but you don't need to take care of us. We're here to be present for them. And that's one of those great nursing qualities that I think that nurses bring to this work is kind of quality of presence. And a few years ago, I wrote a paper with Gene Watson about this, which we can maybe talk a little more about, but how nurses kind of cultivate care through presence. And I suggested to him in the preparation session, I said, one thing that you could try if you wanted is that, that feeling like on a Sunday morning when you don't have to be anywhere and you don't set your alarm clock and you wake up and you're kind of like still in a dream a little bit, you don't have to get up and get anywhere. So you can just kind of linger for a few minutes and kind of think about the dream and, be in that half sleepy state. I said, what if you spent some of your time on this next dosing session like just trying that on? He says, "Oh yeah, that sounds great. I'll try that." And so interestingly, he came in the next time and he took the capsules and he put on he says, I think I'm going to go inside for a little bit. And he says, so that's terminology we use to kind of like be more introspective, maybe put the eye shades on, put the headphones on, and really just allow yourself to be present with that experience. And he went in for like 4 hours. And it's funny because our protocol was to check on, if they were quiet, to check on them every hour. And we had to do vitals and that. So, it was a little opportunity to sort of gently touch him on the arm and say, how you doing in there? He says, "I'm doing good. I want to stay in this space." It was like, okay, and so he really went for it. And he really, when he came out of that, just shared with us these sort of daydreams that he was having and memories that he was having about the trauma to some extent, but also things that really gave him a lot of peace about that experience in his life. And so it was a great teaching for me, I think, is that, we're all so trained as interventionists, just all forms of healthcare. I see this in our students. They're always listening to think like, what do I do? What do I do next? Like, oh, they said something about panic. Maybe I should think about an SSRI, like we're just kind of doing this. It's like patient care becomes this matching test where it's like this symptom occurs and therefore we should do this. And we're always thinking about intervention. And, what I love about doing this work is that it actually brought me back to nursing, which is one of the core things about nursing, which was about presence. It was like, don't just do something, sit there and don't discount the value of your presence and your witnessing in this work and how therapeutic that is. And I think so often, especially when we're early learners, we think we're supposed to be doing something. We're supposed to make some clever interpretation, or we're supposed to identify something or come up with a prescription. It's like the great thing about this is that there's a sort of path that's happening and we just have to walk it with our patients, and I think that is really one thing that I've appreciated about this work is it's really brought me back to something that I've always liked about nursing, which is that we value the quality of presence.
It's so wonderful to hear these examples. So thank you for that. Kind of on the flip side, I'd love to hear either theoretically or like concrete examples of any concerns that you might have or considerations about using psychedelic psychotherapy.
Yeah, well, there are many. So one of which is that psychedelics are a little unusual in that they are not like some new compound that's coming out from a pharmaceutical company that nobody's ever heard of. Lots of people in the general public have had their own experiences with psychedelics, or they know people who have, or they've heard stories about it. So there's kind of this cultural baggage around it in a way that other novel compounds don't necessarily have to deal with. So that can go both good and bad. So we talk about fears that people have about these experiences, and a lot of people bring up kind of the fear of the proverbial bad trip, a difficult psychedelic experience. So that comes up. But there's also this flip side to that, which is this idea that they're miracle cures. And, there were these very breathy headlines in media outlets in the early years of this, and even just a few years ago, one trip and, cured for life and this kind of thing. And that I really think is overpromising it. And then the other complexity is that because this is this sort of slow process moving through the FDA on the one hand, but on the other hand, we have, well, not only the ways that people have always accessed these things, but, we have increasingly like decriminalized use in certain municipalities and states. So, patients are finding these things on their own. They're trying them out. And I think one of the things that's really important to understand about psychedelics is that the context is just as important as the drug. So what is often referred to as set and setting. So the mind set and then the physical setting. So one of the things that's really interesting about psychedelics is their effects are somewhat pluripotent. So, this same drug taken in my lab with the intention to help treat somebody's depression might lead to somebody experiencing grief about the way depression has impacted their life. Experience of feeling connected to something larger than themselves. Whereas that same exact molecule taken at Coachella, could make that music sound amazing. Or they could find themselves feeling, having an experience of fantastic music. And then midway through, they start thinking about when their mother died when they're 8 years old. And, they have this big emotional experience in a setting that doesn't really have a container for it. I used to do harm reduction work at Burning Man, and we would get folks all the time who thought they were going to go out and go dancing and listen to music, and then found themselves thinking about when their mom died when they were 8. And and that's not to say that that was a bad experience for them, but it was an unexpected experience. And thank goodness we had that kind of safe container where people could come to and be attended to by trained volunteers who could help that what could have been a really challenging experience become, at least a neutral or maybe even a positive experience. But this sort of hype in this space, and I've written about this, about how that really, it creates these unrealistic expectations. And we know our patients are desperate because our treatments don't work as well as we want them to. So I understand why people seek these things out on their own, but that can be a somewhat perilous process if you don't know what you're doing and you don't have good guidance.
Gosh, thank you, Andrew. This is so enlightening. I mean, it's definitely not an area of expertise that I have, but sharing from my own practice, I'm currently doing S-ketamine in my treatment, and this is speaking a lot to kind of the experience that I've had with patients. It's not a cure, and I think sometimes the therapeutic value is more than the substance that they take. I kind of with my Spravato treatments, I sometimes wonder if it's more, it reminds me of Cheers, that old, sitcom where
sure.
people would come back to the clinic and the front desk would be like, "Oh, Joan, oh, hey, how you doing?" And the people are like, "Oh, I'm feeling accepted. There's somebody here that really, I'm bonding with. I have to come, but it's just something that I really think is, and so meaningful." And I love how you highlight this idea that, there's work in this. And and just what you said, I'm thinking, just, because you do hear that, the bad trip, and I've had a couple of patients who come to me and just kind of like, I'm going to just take a little bit of a mushroom at night, and I think that's because that's been researched, right? And you have to do the whole education. No, that's just a piece of this sort of thing. So I appreciate, and maybe you have more to kind of say of what's the context of that bad trip. How do you conceptualize a bad trip these days, as you've had so much experience with using these psychedelics?
Yeah, well, I do want to say about, what you've noticed in your clinic, I think is really interesting because it speaks to the community aspect of this, right? And one of the things that, I think COVID really highlighted is how psychologically deleterious it is to be alone in the world, and how many of our illnesses that we treat in psychiatry involve being alone. The former National Institute of Mental Health, Tom Insel, wrote this book about how isolation is really, killing us. And so one of the things that's interesting about psychedelics is the potential for group treatment. And group therapy, when I went through school, always felt like sort of like the low cost alternative, and I worked for a big insurer that liked to push group therapy. But really, I think group therapy could have an amazing revival through psychedelic experiences, because one of the things that is very common in psychedelic experiences, and I will answer your question about bad trips, I'm not avoiding it, is that they often engender experience of feeling connected to something larger than yourself. And, that can be the experience of awe, which is, sometimes referred to as the small self, which is like, hey, like, imagine when you've seen an amazing sunset or something, you realize there's beauty in the world. And my little neurotic churn that happens in my head and your head and everyone's head, maybe isn't that important, that there's something much bigger than all of this, all of us. And to feel connected to that is salutary. Now, the bad trip notion is, we often call them difficult experiences or challenging experiences. And one of the things that I do advise subjects when they're coming into the study, especially with psilocybin, is that this tends to kind of amplify emotions. And so whatever you're coming into this with often will get kind of louder in the experience. It's also a little bit unpredictable which way it's going to go. So, you think you're going to go listen to Diplo or something, and what you find is you're crying about, when your mom died when you were 8. And you weren't expecting that, right? And the emotions that you're experiencing are amplified in a way that they aren't normally, that you're not normally able to kind of maybe consciously tamp down. And so a lot of times when people are having a difficult emotional experience, it can be autobiographical. There's some kind of grief, some kind of trauma. And a lot of times in a therapeutic context, we're specifically going into that, right? So, we're in the MDMA PTSD work, we had an agreement with our subjects because, as we all know, PTSD is often marked by avoidance. And so we had an agreement with our subjects that if we haven't talked about the trauma during the course of the session, the therapist will bring it up. Honestly, because of the prep work that we did, we really rarely ever had to evoke that, because the subjects came in wanting to talk about that. But sometimes under a psychedelic experience, the ability to kind of hold back difficult memories or difficult thoughts is eroded, and those can be overwhelming if people are not prepared for it. There can also be some kind of panic type symptoms that people will have, just feeling weird. Many of our patients with anxiety disorders and panic disorders are often very sensitive to kind of that internal experience of feeling off, feeling weird, not being able to turn a thought off. That can be anxiety generating. So this is why it's really, really important to have that preparatory work in place, where you've got a known person there in the room with you who you've already talked about these concerns, and and that person is known to you. You've already talked about ways of calming yourself, maybe deep breathing or grounding. And also, it's really important to know that these experiences, in psychedelic experiences, are transient. That while it may be really intense right now, 5 minutes from now, your mind might shift to something else. And that's often what happens, is that, I've seen people be crying and then 30 seconds later they're laughing, or they're laughing and then they're crying. It's just, you go through these waves of emotional experience. And a lot of times what seems to happen from that is the experience of actively not avoiding the emotion is salutary. So we know that one of the things that really predicts for things like depression is emotional avoidance. When people deploy a lot of strategies and use a lot of energy to not feel their feelings, it comes at a price. Right. And that price may be depression or PTSD symptoms. And so what this is as an opportunity is to maybe go into them and realize, like, oh, that was hard, but it wasn't so terrible. I was able to do that, in much the same way that like a vaccine challenges your immune system. Remember when we all got our COVID shots and everyone was like, oh, how'd you feel afterwards? I was tired for a couple of days. I felt kind of feverish. Well, that was, your immune system charging up, right? And it made you stronger as a result. And so maybe there's a psychological corollary to that as well, that we get to make more possible or more tolerable with the combination of therapy plus drug.
I have a follow-up to that. So, as you were talking, I was just thinking, with other trauma modalities, sometimes we can see, even with preparation into work on the very specific trauma experience. In that specific trauma, like while doing work on that specific trauma, we still find that patients sometimes are flooded and overwhelmed. And, though we did the best that we could to prepare, there it's still, that they still had that flooding experience. And, on the other side of that, in my experience, I've sometimes seen that flooding and that overwhelm of emotion can continue on for, days, weeks, even months, depending on intervention afterwards. And I was hearing you say that, one of the things that's really unique about psychedelic work is that patients are really getting this experience of noticing how transient our emotions can be in real time. In your experience, have you noticed, in when unexpected intense emotions come up a patient or an individual is going under a psychedelic experience, does that tend to reverberate into later, like the days and weeks and months coming, like sometimes we can see with other traditional trauma work, or is that something that you tend to see remain pretty transient as well?
It's a great question, Kendra. I mean, it can, because these experiences, particularly in sort of less regulated, less intentional settings, can be destabilizing for people. So that is something that we have to keep in mind, and it's one of the reasons why you have that integration therapy so closely proximal to the experience, so that you can kind of catch that. One of the things that's interesting about MDMA in particular is that, what you were describing there, this sort of tolerability window, which is somewhere between when people get totally flooded or when they shut down and get dissociated, is pretty narrow in most people with PTSD. And so it doesn't take too much to get them flooded or get them shut down. And what's interesting about MDMA is it appears to sort of widen that window. And part of the reason it may do that on a sort of biological substrate level is that MDMA has an interesting thing of sort of quieting the right amygdala, which is where a lot of our that sort of fear response resides. And so there's actually been neuroimaging studies, fMRI studies, looking at the activity of the right amygdala. And so that activity tends to go down and the prefrontal cortex activity tends to go up, which is what we need in order to kind of contextualize traumatic memories and be able to work with them, is to not be flooded by that fear response and be able to use our prefrontal lobes to think more flexibly about them. And so that may be part of what's going on biologically, which allows this to happen. It's not just kind of feeling good, and what that means in the therapy room is that people can actually tolerate talking about their trauma for a longer period of time or more deeply than they would have been otherwise.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, sorry, Kendra, stepping on you. Apologize, but yeah, I think this whole conversation's been just fascinating, and just want to unfortunately look at the clock and say that we're kind of running out of time here. But I want to express my deepest thanks to Mr. Andrew Penn here, who's sharing his expertise and just, I hope, enlightened everybody who listened to this, because I think this is just something that we will continue to see. And I think, if maybe that's kind of our final thought, if you wouldn't mind sharing, Andrew, what do you see as the future of psychedelic psychotherapy, either within nursing or outside or just in general? Big question for like a minute. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I really just want to impress upon how well suited nursing is to psychedelic therapy. Quite honestly, psychedelic therapy made me fall back in love with nursing, because when I realized, and this is the thrust of the paper that I co-wrote with Gene Watson, and I'm happy to send you a link to it. But really, these core values of nursing that Gene has really spent her whole career kind of describing, like, what is this ineffable thing that we call care? And honestly, a lot of Jean's work, when I read it as a nursing student, I didn't understand what the heck she was talking about, because it's kind of mystical, right? And it's kind of, but when I looked at it through the frame of the work that I do with psychedelics, it's like, oh, this totally makes sense now. And so much of what we do, which is like care and presence and endurance, like, think about it. These are 8 to 10 hour sessions sometimes. Well, a lot of my psychotherapist colleagues are like, that's a long day. I'm like, it's just like a shift in the ICU with a delirious patient. Like, we can roll with that. And we take care of the patient's body too. Like, if they had an episode of incontinence, I'm not squicked out by dealing with that. I'm a nurse, and so, and if the person gets hypertensive, which is something that we have to keep track of, I can manage that, so there's, but more critically, it's about this quality of presence and not necessarily needing to do something other than show up fully. And that's what nurses are so good at doing when we're not being pulled in 10 different directions by our EHR and silly mandates that we have to follow. But, the beautiful thing about these days that I get to do these is that I have nothing else pulling on my threads. Like, I can just be there with that patient fully for the duration of the experience. And that is why I got into this work to begin with.
All right. That's a round of applause. You can't see it, this is audio podcast, but yes, thank you so much. And again, just very much appreciate it. It's a great way to finish Peplau's Ghost episode here and really kind of highlighting nursing. So thank you again. We'll be out with a new episode soon. So please feel free to like, subscribe, comment, and we'll see you at our next episode. Take care.
Work hard until those thoughts are finally leaving so you can be you. They feel it, therefore it's true. Work hard until those thoughts are finally leaving so you can be you. Guided discovery. Identifying, challenging your beliefs. Reframing your mind, negative thoughts release. Let it go. These cognitive distortions decrease until they cease. Yeah, guided discovery. Identifying, challenging your beliefs. Reframing your mind. Overgeneralization, global labeling, emotional reasoning. Too much salt like this, too much seasoning. They feel it, therefore it's true. Work hard until those thoughts are finally leaving so you can be you. They feel it, therefore it's true. Work hard until those thoughts are finally leaving so you can be you. Guided discovery. Identifying, challenging your beliefs. Reframing your mind, negative thoughts release. Let it go. These cognitive distortions decrease until they cease. Yeah, guided discovery. Identifying, challenging your beliefs. Reframing your mind, negative thoughts release. Let it go. These cognitive distortions decrease until they cease.